Okay, welcome back to Criminology. We're going to talk a little bit about measures of crime, okay? Because here in the United States, we see lots of different kind of trends in crime based on lots of different factors, and we're going to go over a few of those in this subsection. But each one kind of has to be explained. Why do we see crime in some groups more than others, or in some geographic areas more than others, or in some times more than others? So, first we have to talk about how do we measure crime? How do we know how much crime is happening? Right? Well, there are two major ways. The first is the UCR, or the Uniform Crime Report. This is data gathered by the FBI. And every police department in the country submits their data about crime that was reported to them every year to the FBI, who gathers all that data, together, compiles it into one yearly report about crime all over the country, so we can track it by geography, by time, by type of crime. And this Uniform Crime Report has been being gathered since like the 1930s. So you can go back really far for certain kinds of crime and see how it's changed over time, and all these different kind of just tons and tons and tons of data. But there are some problems with the UCR. The biggest of which is probably the fact that it only counts crime that is reported to police. If a crime happens but nobody ever tells the police about it, it can't enter into the UCR, right? And that's probably not going to happen with things like murders. But it could happen with things like, a minor burglaries, or maybe even an auto theft for a really cheap car that the person just really doesn't even care about. So, kind of the further down you go on the seriousness of crimes, there's probably a bigger and bigger and bigger underreporting problem. And the UCR only tracks the reported crime, right? So we also need to look at other measures of crime. And the second of these major measures of crime is the NCVS, or the National Crime Victimization Survey. And this is also run through the US government, although a different part of the US government. And with the NCVS, they take a sample of households across the country, and they interview those households about whether they've been the victim of a crime in the recent past, right? So they'll come in and they'll ask you, oh, well, has anybody in the house had a car stolen? Has anybody in the house been murdered? Has anybody in the house been assaulted? All those things. And they use that to track crime in the same way that the UCR does. Now, obviously, this doesn't have the problem of only looking at reported crime. This looks at all different kinds of crime. But there are other assorted problems with the NCVS. First off, it's only a sample, so we can, hopefully that sample is representative of the entire country, but it might not be, right? There might be assorted issues, assorted sampling errors, which, again, you're free to take my research methods course to understand more about sampling error. But there are other minor issues with the NCVS. So using both the UCR and the NCVS is probably, even though they're measuring slightly different things in very different ways, they tend to track pretty well closely together, in that if one says crime is increasing, the other will almost definitely say crime is increasing at almost the exact same rate, right? Or if it's one says it's decreasing, the other will almost definitely say it's decreasing and at roughly the same rate. So they track each other pretty well in that regard. But keep in mind, they are measuring two different things. One measuring is reported crime, the other's measuring victimizations. So how and when we use each of these is really going to depend on a lot of different factors. And then there's other ways to measure crime, usually a lot more localized, right? So we won't be able to track crime over the entire nation with these other methods, but we might be able to track crime in a city, or track crime even in a state or a county, or some very specific kind of crime over time, that kind of thing. But the two big national, very kind of generalized measures of crime are the UCR and the NCVS. Okay? Now, what do the UCR and the NCVS tell us about crime based on different factors? Well, first one we can look at is over time. This is something vastly misunderstood by the American people. If you ask the American people, is crime going up or down? The majority will say crime is going up. But based on these official measures of crime, crime has been plummeting for years, for decades. All of the official measures of crime we have say that crime peaked in kind of the mid-early 90s, and it's been going down very steeply ever since, right? All different kinds of crime in all over the country has plummeted compared to what it was just a few decades ago. It's been very consistent, very steady, slow decrease in crime. Why? What is it that caused this criminal peak in the early 90s and that is now causing crime to get less and less and less and less and more rare and more rare and more rare, right? Does each theory we're going to talk about in this class kind of identify what might have caused this? Okay? And there's tons of different ideas about there. There are tons of different ideas out there about why crime has been so consistently going down. But then the other thing, of course, we have to talk about is why people think crime is getting worse. And that one, I will almost guarantee you, it's not... Crim theory doesn't attempt to explain why people's perceptions of crime are increasing when actual crime is decreasing. My idea is it's the media. It's the amount of crime coverage on the news has increased even as crime has gone down. But that's a lecture for a different course, right? So, we know crime kind of looks like this over time. But now, what about by geography? So, lots of crime happens in cities. But of course crime happens in cities. That's where the people are. So instead of looking at number of crimes, we need to look at crime rates. In other words, crimes per person. Right? And when we do that, we notice that crime isn't necessarily in the biggest cities. Right? So if you think about the biggest cities in the country, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, even Dallas and Houston, the states that those cities are in are, they're not the most crime-free areas, but they're nowhere near the worst either. If we look at crime rates by geography, it tends to be, honestly, the more rural states that have the highest crime rates, like Nevada and Alaska and New Mexico, right? Those are very rural states. The vast majority of their kind of geography is very lightly populated, right? So it's not necessarily the states that one might think based on, talking heads on TV, where we actually find the most crime per person. It is much more concentrated in these other different kinds of areas. So why? Why do we see so much more crime in these states than those other ones? Why are Maine and Virginia and Idaho and Wyoming have such low crime rates when Tennessee and Alaska and Arkansas and Alabama have such high crime rates? Is it a matter of measurement? Are crimes just being reported less in those places? Is it a matter of lack of opportunity for criminals? Is it better or worse education? Is it what is it? So each theory has to kind of hopefully tell us why we see these varying crime rates in these different geographic areas of the country. So by time of day, we can look at when do crimes happen over a 24-hour period, right? And what we see is not only is there a distinct pattern, but it depends on whether the criminal is a juvenile or an adult. So as you can see from this graph, juvenile crime tends to peak kind of in the after school hours. Adult crime tends to peak in the early nighttime hours, right? And then both tend to have a minimum in the, the early morning around sunrise kind of time. Why? Why do we see this pattern? Is it the nature of society? Is it the nature of crime? Is it some method or reason for these different, for crimes to show this pattern? And then why the difference between juvenile crime and adult crime? Is there a different cause for juveniles to commit crime versus adults to commit crime? Now, what about time of year, right? As you can see, there's also seems to be a pattern here where crime peaks during the summer months and is at a minimum during the winter months. Why? Is it just the weather? Is it something to do with tax season or football season or something? Like what? Why is crime higher during the summer than in the winter? But there is a definite pattern for when, over the course of any given year, crime is at its highest or lowest. And then age. We consistently see the same pattern with age. Okay? Criminality kind of rises sharply as youths hit the kind of teenage years, peaking in the late teens, and then drops off. Very, very consistently, to the point where people my age and above are committing almost none of the crime that happens. Why? I'm just as in need of, money and food and stuff. So if the primary driver of crime is just obtaining money, shouldn't crime be fairly spread evenly across all age groups? If the cause of crime is biology, and people are born as criminals or not, shouldn't we see an even spread of crime among all ages? So your explanation for crime should hopefully be able to account for why we see this giant spike in criminality in the late teen years, and then this kind of dying off, this kind of drop in criminality as people get older and older and older. And then gender. Men have consistently committed more crime than women since we started measuring who commits crime. But interestingly, that gap is narrowing. This is relatively old data. I couldn't find a good graph that shows data that's more recent, but as you can see here, the gap between male crime and female crime was huge in the late 20th century. And then in the 21st century, it's gotten narrower and narrower and narrower. To the point where now men still commit more crime than women, but the gap is much more narrow than it has been traditionally. Why? Is it men getting less criminal or women getting more criminal? What's going on? What explanations for crime can account for this fact that A, men commit more crime than women, but B, that gap has now narrowed to probably at or near the smallest gap we've had since we started measuring this. Why? Right? So our theories have to kind of at least give some kind of explanation for why we see those patterns in crime by time, by geography, by age, by gender, by race, by religion, by all these different factors, right? So think about those measures of crime. Think about those graphs as we're going through each one of these different theories, and ask yourself, does this theory even attempt to kind of explain why we see that kind of pattern of behavior in crime by age, by geography, by gender, right? Or does this theory kind of just completely ignore that pattern? But anyway, now you know a little bit about how crime is happening and when it's happening. And I will see you in the next section. Thank you so much for watching.